This house could have died. It didn't. It became a company. $207 million a year. One family branch learned to sell their past to the present and saved a 178,000 square foot house in the process. In a country where dynasties faded into bankruptcy, this one pivoted to professionalism. That pivot didn't feel glamorous. It looked like ledgers, contracts, and late nights at the kitchen table. But it changed everything. Listen, imagine a mansion the size of a small city block, hallways you could get lost in, a library with room after room of books, chandeliers heavy enough to require scaffolding. That is the scale of the place. America's largest private house, 178,000 square feet under one roof. The Biltmore has the bones of a fairy tale and the weight of a balance sheet. At first, the story is architecture. It's Richard Morris Hunt's limestone and the long, deliberate hand of Frederick Law Olmsted on the grounds. Built at the end of the 19th century, it was meant to be a statement of taste, wealth, and permanence. But permanence is a fragile thing. Across the 20th century, other branches of the Vanderbilt family lost their fortunes. Mansions were sold. Collections were auctioned. The gilding faded. Money that had once seemed infinite thinned, then evaporated. So how did one branch, the Cecils, descendants of Cornelius Vanderbilt in this telling, keep the Biltmore from the same fate? The answer is almost shocking for how prosaic it is. They did not treat the house like a shrine. They treated it like a business. In the 1950s, facing rising maintenance costs and a shifting economy, the family began what today reads as a textbook in forensic preservation economics. The strategy was not an art project. It was a B2B and B2C business plan executed in public view. Open sacred rooms to paying guests, sell curated experiences, host companies for conferences and launches, license the brand to wine, retail, and hospitality partners, and keep the estate functioning as an operating enterprise rather than a static museum. Think about that for a moment. Turning a private home into a functioning enterprise means reimagining every square foot as potential revenue, or at least necessary operating capital. Rooms once reserved for private conversation became leased spaces for weddings and film shoots. Service staff were professionalized, trained, and scaled. The gardens became a product you could sell tickets to enjoy. The family's legacy, portraits, architecture, story, became inventory. This was not a single decision. It was a series of decisions with a forensics trail you can read in contracts, budgets, and guest ledgers. It is the rare reverse of the usual ruin story. When dynasties fail, we usually trace decay to extravagant spending or poor investments. Here, the forensic work shows a disciplined conversion of fixed costs into revenue streams. The house's enormous upkeep, heating, rooftop repairs, staff, insurance, was turned into a liability that could be serviced because revenue started to flow. Slowly, carefully, the estate was professionalized. Let's walk through that shift. In the 1950s, the world was changing. Automobile travel and leisure tourism were growing. Families who once visited museums in big cities now drove to the countryside for weekend escapes. The Cecils recognized a simple, uncomfortable truth. The property could not remain private without external cash flow. They opened their doors to visitors. Admission fees were not charity. They were pricing signals. This experience had value. They invested the proceeds back into the estate, beginning a virtuous circle. But the nuance matters. The first tours were not full-scale operations. They were experimental. Guided pathways, controlled access to the grand rooms, interpretive placards, and trained docents. That model solved two problems at once. It raised money and protected the collection. Visitors were monetized, but their movements were managed, so the house was preserved. Preservation and profitability began to march together. Next came diversification. The estate didn't sell everything it was. It sold what it could without losing its essence. Gardens hosted concerts. The carriage house became a shop for carefully branded merchandise. The wine made from estate grapes moved from novelty to legitimate product lines, marketed to restaurants and retailers. Weddings and corporate events became predictable, premium revenue sources. Film crews rented interiors for shots that demanded historical authenticity. Each of these new activities required contracts, insurance, operations planning, and a customer service mindset that the family had never needed before. Crucially, the Cecils treated legacy as a business-to-business asset, not only as a consumer spectacle. They developed partnerships. Travel agencies packaged overnight stays with local hotels. Corporations booked the estate for retreats and product launches, essentially outsourcing their experience production to the Biltmore's operational teams. Museums and universities collaborated for conservation labs and rotating exhibitions. These were B2B relationships, multi-year contracts that smoothed the feast and famine pattern of private visits and weddings. From a forensic perspective, that was the turning point. Revenue predictability rose, cash flow stabilized, capital planning became possible. There were governance shifts, too. Where once family members sat at the head of the table and made gut calls, the Cecils began to hire professionals. Estate managers with hospitality experience, marketing directors who knew how to sell an experience in an age of glossy travel magazines, accountants who could translate preservation into amortizable capital investments. Financial reports replaced anecdotes. The family still held the brand and the mission, but they outsourced execution to specialists who knew how to scale. This is where the phrase, pivot to professionalism, becomes literal. The home required an operating model akin to a resort and a museum combined. Maintenance crews worked like a small city's public works department. Curators managed collections and donor relations. A wine team tended vines, modernized fermentation, and built distribution. The staff had payroll complexities, union considerations, and year-round scheduling, the same issues modern hospitality chains handle. The estate learned to think in terms of occupancy, per-guest revenue, ancillary sales, and lifetime value. It also learned to inventory its intangible assets, the brand, the story, the name, and monetize them in repeatable ways. Over decades, those decisions compounded. Revenue grew, investment followed. Conservation projects were funded not by one-off auctions but by operating surpluses. The estate's balance sheet thickened with retained earnings. Capital was available to restore roofing, stabilize historic plaster, update HVAC systems that would have otherwise ruined antique woodwork. The house's very survival came to depend on being an ongoing economic actor in its region. You can see the effect when you look at the numbers that define the modern estate. What might have been a bankrupt relic became instead a diversified enterprise generating hundreds of millions annually. Visitors come in steady streams, but the event calendar, winery sales, retail, lodging partnerships, and corporate contracts are the scaffolding that makes the experience sustainable. That $207 million figure is not a windfall. It's the end product of decades of incremental, practical choices, pricing for sustainability, investing in guest services, forming long-term partnerships, and keeping a relentless eye on margins and mission. There is something quietly radical about that. The family could have protected the estate by walling it off, by treating preservation as a private, elitist duty. Instead, they exposed their greatest asset to the market. That exposure could have destroyed them. It could have been mismanaged, turned into tacky spectacles, or bartered for short-term gain. Instead, the family's discipline and their willingness to adopt professional norms, accounting, marketing, human resources, legal structures, insulated the estate from those perils. Along the way, tensions reappear. Each new revenue idea carried risk. Opening the house meant wear. Hosting a high-end wedding introduced potential damage and reputational hazards. Selling wine required agronomy expertise and distribution headaches. Taking film crews onto the parlor floor invited the possibility of a scratched floor or a badly staged scene that would offend preservationists. The family navigated these with policy, careful contracts, clear liability terms, and investment in staff training. They didn't simply say yes. They built systems for saying yes safely. There were also cultural tensions. For a family steeped in private tradition, monetizing a lineage meant redefining dignity. You can almost hear the debates across the kitchen table. Is this selling out? Are we converting heritage into commerce? The pragmatic answer won out because the alternative was loss. Preservationists, historians, and the local community ultimately benefited as well. The estate's continuity meant jobs, tax revenues, and a maintained historic landscape that otherwise could have been parceled and lost. This forensic anatomy of survival offers lessons that apply far beyond mansions and wine. Many family assets, from proprietary technology to brand names or real estate, are at risk when they are treated only as heirlooms. The Biltmore demonstrates how a legacy can be reframed as an asset class that serves other businesses and consumers. Treat the legacy like intellectual property. License it. Partner on experiences. Build recurring contracts. Inject professional governance. Those moves convert an emotional burden into an economic engine. Midway through this story, take a breath. If you're enjoying the deep dive, consider subscribing to follow these kinds of forensic histories, where finance meets family and architecture meets strategy. There's more to learn about how decisions made in small rooms echo across generations. Back to the estate. The professionalization didn't erase romance. It simply channeled it. The big rooms retained their varnish. The gardens continued to bloom. But they did so on a budget with forecasts and targets. The staff learned to steward both the artifacts and the guest experience. Graduate students got internships in conservation. Local vendors supplied food and services. The house became a hub for economic life rather than a static memoriam. That matters. Preservation without purpose is fragile. Preservation with purpose endures. By the early 21st century, the Forbes-style headlines about vanished fortunes had become less relevant to the Biltmore. The story now focused on operations, occupancy rates, per capita spend, retail margins, wine case sales, and event bookings. The house that once symbolized private opulence now represented a pragmatic model of legacy capitalism. It showed how to use market mechanisms to fund stewardship. There is a moral question in all this. Do you turn a family's history into a product? The Cecil's Choice answers that question with a hard yes, but with a condition. You do it only if you are willing to be serious about it. Slapdash commercialization ruins both brand and building. Thoughtful professionalization preserves both and creates social value. The estate's transformation was not a betrayal. It was an act of caretaking shaped by spreadsheets and tender, loving detail. In the final third of the story, the personal stakes become real. The house that survived became a platform for education, employment, and community identity. The family's choice to professionalize created roles for historians, for gardeners, for hospitality workers. It allowed scholarship to continue. It allowed the estate to fund outreach and conservation that would otherwise have been impossible. The economic engine did not replace the emotional core of the place. It amplified it by making continuity possible. And on a human level, think about the last family member to walk those hallways who remembers a private childhood and then witnesses a bustling tour group decades later. Think of stewards who have dedicated their careers to maintaining plaster and tapestry. Their dignity is secured by paychecks, benefits, and the knowledge that their work matters. The forensic instruments that saved the house, budgets, contracts, and professional teams, also saved livelihoods. This is the end game of the pivot to professionalism. It's not just survival, it's stewardship funded at scale. It's a legacy that can be passed on with a ledger attached, a mission that is institutionally resilient rather than personally fragile. So what does the Biltmore now teach families and institutions watching their own legacies erode? First, be honest about scale. Large historic assets have recurring fixed costs that will outlast private pocketbooks. Second, Diversify revenue in ways consistent with mission. Third, professionalize governance. Hiring the right experts early prevents mistakes that become irreversible. Fourth, treat your legacy as IP that can be licensed and partnered with other businesses, not a museum piece wedged into silence. And finally, recognize that monetization and reverence are not mutually exclusive. They are, when done properly, mutually enabling. As we close, picture the house at dusk. Lights glow through high windows. Guests cross gravel paths toward a dinner event. A docent points out a carved mantel. Somewhere a wine delivery truck backs in. The sound of the place is the sound of people being paid to care for history. It is the hum of a business that also keeps a family memory alive. If you found this story useful, a quiet way to support this channel is to subscribe and share, so more stories like this about how markets and memory intersect can find you. Thank you for listening. The Biltmore's survival wasn't luck. It was a slow, deliberate exercise in design, not only of gardens and facades, but of governance and economics. The family learned to speak the language of business so the house could keep speaking to the future. That is the paradox at the heart of many failed dynasties. The way out of ruin is often a pragmatic turn toward professionalism. When legacy becomes a repeatable, contractual asset, preservation becomes possible. That is how a mansion became a company, and how a house became, quietly and steadfastly, a lasting story.